This one actually doesn't come from Reddit. This was a conversation I had with a friend who raised something that is talked about in some sexual circles, which is called the orgasm gap between men and women. Statistically, women have orgasm a smaller percentage of the time per sexual encounter with heterosexual men or in heterosexual encounters than men do. I think this is not rocket science. I think most people who have been sexually active in heterosexual contexts, the sexual act culminates with the man's orgasm to some degree, and it's the sine qua non for most heterosexual sexual engagements. But from a feminist perspective, from a social perspective, she was raising this as an issue that was emblematic of women's sexual repression or the lack of familiarity with female pleasure.
Inequity in
orgasms
is what this is, obviously.
There's some aspect of that for sure. I think one of the, and to be totally fair to the conversation, I don't think she was coming at it from a this is an injustice, must be righted perspective, so much as a well-meaning perspective on the notion of fairness in relationships. And we were in a coffee shop. I didn't want to get deep into the kink conversation, but one of the things that brought up for me is that so few people have considered the notion explicitly of what an orgasm means psychologically and emotionally. And I think it means something different to men and women. I think plenty of men and women, or plenty of women will say, oh, I don't really need an orgasm to be fulfilled by sex. Very few men will say that, relative percentage-wise. Right? And I don't think that's bullshit. I don't think that's a socially programmed, oh, you should be okay, as a woman, you should be okay with this sort of inadequate experience. And part of the way I know that is that when I was younger, I was very diligent. I had a lot of female friends. I was very sensitive to these kinds of notions. I was very diligent about making sure that my girlfriend came just as much as I did, trying to keep that ratio very close to 1-to-1. And most women in the relationship pushed back and said, look, actually, this is getting annoying. Like, I don't want to come every time we have sex. I don't want to have to come every time we have sex. You can make me come, but it's a lot of time. It takes more effort. It means that we have to do certain things, like you have to go down on me. It creates a set of constraints that I don't always want to be in and committed to every time we have sex, because sometimes it can just be great to connect with you and to know that I've pleased you. And again, all of this was in a dom-sum framework, right? And so I was explicitly kinky quite young, and I thought of it from almost a daddy dom perspective, taking care of my submissive partner and making sure she was well cared for, and so on and so forth. But it was interesting to me, and the first time it happened, you say, okay, that's just her. It's just one person, right? You're young, you haven't had that much experience. But it was an experience that I had several times with many women, right? And it's something that I now have learned to discuss in a relationship as you're setting up at the kink dynamic is, what does it mean to you to come during sex? And I think what's really interesting is to start describing fairness in relationships in terms of the whole person, or the meanings that the whole person assigns to various aspects of the relationship, including sex. So it's not necessarily one-to-one orgasm for orgasm if the person you're with places a different value on orgasm itself versus a different value on some other part of the experience. And so the notion of fairness in an intimate relationship may hinge more on the personal individual values of the participants that can't really be seen or judged well from the outside. But you can see that very specifically in a kink that I developed later. This was a late development. I didn't have orgasm denial as a kink when I was younger. It's something that has become a very big kink for me. And part of what that highlights to me is that and you can see this online, even in certain orgasm denial subreddits, is that there is a kinky arousal in asserting the dominance of me coming more than she does. If you want to get super nerdy with it, I've had subs where I made them track how many times she came and how many times I came, and I want to make sure that my pleasure is at least 5 times more important than yours, so that ratio needs to be at least 5-to-1. And by assigning meaning to the gap, by assigning meaning to that ratio, that this is a symbol of our dominant and submissive relationship, that actually there's something to take pride in your prioritizing of my pleasure, well, now the gap is not an accident. It's not something that happens out of an inadvertent lack of care for her pleasure or an inability to pleasure her or an unfamiliarity with her body. It's a deliberate attempt. There's meaning in the gap. And that all of a sudden is not only very tolerable, but preferable. It's enjoyable. Now, a lot of women wouldn't want a 5-to-1. They would want 3-to-1 or 2-to-1, right? But I also have not come across very many women who are truly mostly fulfilled by a 1-to-1 ratio. Attempting that, I think, showed me that the number of women who truly are fulfilled by hitting a 1-to-1 ratio and embracing all the constraints that go with that is that sex has to last a certain period of time. It has to involve certain things. There's no way out. Or we're not having sex, right? Because otherwise we're not going to hit a 1-to-1 ratio, right? Most women would not want that. They would be more fulfilled by a relationship in which they came less and the experience was different, as long as it means something, as long as it's not his incompetence. Because if what it means is that you're not good at getting me off, if you're not competent to know where my clit is, well, I don't like that meaning. I don't know if you've come across that.
When you say come across, did you mean that as a pun or?
I did not, but I do know.
I think evolutionarily it makes sense as well, obviously, right? It's far more important for the man to come for the promotion of the species. If a woman doesn't come, I don't think that actually impacts fertility as far as I'm aware.
There were actually interesting articles trying to show that, and there was a while there where it was claimed that a woman's orgasm increased sperm uptake into the whatever. It has all been actually subsequently disproven, which is
I think the other reason is something you
anyway.
point to, and you've told me many times in our private conversations as well, which refers to the idea that for women, they need a story. Right? When they're having sex, they need to be enmeshed in a story. For a man, it's very much, I think story is definitely important to some extent, but there's also, it becomes very biological the longer you go not orgasming, right? You don't need a story 1 week out from the last orgasm. You can just knock it off without a story. Whereas women typically always need a story, and then that story needs a build-up. They have to be in the story. And then if they're also, quote-unquote, expected to come every time, that could also produce a lot of pressure on them, right? And then that makes it even harder for them to come. And then they're like, okay, my man is not satisfied, or he feels that it's important for me to come, and if I'm not coming, I'm falling short, and it creates a lot of stress and tension. Now, again, this can be wonderfully reframed and operationalized, as you just mentioned, in the Kink dynamic, which is, no, we are doing this deliberately, and perhaps I'm even going to exaggerate it for effect a little bit, as long as I can ensconce it in a good story. So it's a good thing to operationalize if you can turn that into a story that's consonant with the entire Kink dynamic that you're having.
It's funny you mentioned the biological thing, because that actually is one of my kinks and something I enjoy teasing partners with, right? In this orgasm denial framework, right? Of teasing her that if I come, that's necessary for the propagation of the species. Your orgasm is actually not necessary. Even God doesn't, so I mean, like you and it can be, we're joking about it, but it can be a very hot framework of teasing a woman up to the edge of orgasm and then making her admit that it doesn't matter as much as mine. And so those kinky behaviors give meaning to the denial, right? It's not that I couldn't get you off. I brought you right up to the edge and then stopped to reinforce this pattern. And what's interesting about that is, and this is why I think kink works better in longer term relationships, because you can set up these contexts, is that if last night I teased you right up to the edge and then denied you and didn't let you come, and today I just fuck you as a quickie and don't even tease you, the meaning of my not paying attention to your pleasure now was set up over the last 2 days of how I framed that denial, that orgasm gap. And then when I do let you come, then it's a privilege. Then it's framed as, oh, yes, you've been a good girl, and now I'm going to let you come. Yeah. And so you're now assigning meaning to it. I will comment on one thing. I will say that I think among men, I'm a little bit odd in that regard, is that even when I'm like just masturbating, I need a story. I am fantasizing in a very story-driven kind of way, and that usually is the thing that gets me off. So I'm more story-driven than the average guy. I think even for the average guy, I think that because men can get off visually without a story or just through the sex drive, One of the reasons men find kink later than women, on average, they underestimate the degree to which a story can enhance even male sexual pleasure and the experience of sex. Because you can get to orgasm without it, whereas a woman has a harder time on average getting to orgasm without a story. And we see that in the consumption of erotic material, right? Men consume visual porn, women tend to consume erotic writing statistically, right? But reversing that or being subversive to that and men engaging in story drive, I think can be very enhancing. I think that's part of the experience of kink and the awakening that happens for men engaging in kinky behavior is, oh shit, there's this whole other dimension that adds a layer of perceptual pleasure on top of the merely sensory pleasure that I had no idea about.